Egypt, Lebanon, Libya, the UAE, Israel, Tunisia, and Oman all imported nearly half of their annual supply of wheat from the two countries. So the Russian invasion not only interrupted the wheat harvest and exports in Ukraine, but also impacted countries' ability and desire to purchase wheat from Russia and impeded the global supply of fertilizers. As a result, wheat prices have risen more than 60% this year, and when combined with the COVID pandemic and mounting economic constraints, high dependence on Russian and Ukrainian food exports exacerbate humanitarian crises in parts of the region like Syria and Yemen. Moreover, high food prices and shortages have the potential to cause social unrest, severe instability, fiscal crises, and waves of migration. I am eager to hear from our witnesses today on the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on food security in the region, and specifically what the U.S. and our international partners can do to help alleviate the needs. Russia has a significant conventional military and mercenary presence in the Middle East and North Africa, but the war in Ukraine has caused Russia to shift resources and attention away from the region. Russia has had a naval installation in Tartus, Syria since the early 70s and has been integral to Bashar al-Assad's enabling his regime to cling to power. And while the success of Russian forces and the necessity of Russian support in Syria heightened perceptions of Russian influence, its failures in Ukraine have sobered the region's understanding of Russian capabilities and reduced the desire for Russian defense exports. Russia has had a military presence in Libya since the 2019 civil war when it intervened on behalf of Khalifa Haftar through the deployment of Russian military personnel and mercenaries from Syria and the Kremlin-backed private military force, the Wagner Group. While fighters remain in Libya today on Moscow's behalf, a significant number of them have moved to Ukraine in recent weeks to reinforce Russia's battered army. And I hope to hear more from our witnesses today about Russia's current force posture in the Middle East and North Africa, their operational and strategic goals in the region, and how these have shifted since the invasion of Ukraine in February. On the diplomatic front, countries in the Middle East and North Africa region are an important asset to the world's response against the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with Russia accounting for approximately 34% of the oil and 40% of the natural gas to Europe. Countries in the region have the opportunity to support new supply sources and to help solidify European energy independence from Russia. Russia has attempted to advance diplomatic relations with countries in the Middle East like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Libya. Over the past few years in particular, Russia has perceived an opportunity to court regional leaders who seek leverage against the U.S. or to exploit concerns of U.S. partners about the reliability of U.S. support. Russia's behavior on many important regional issues, including Bab al-Hawa border reauthorization in Syria coming up in July, is threatening international stability and security further. In addition, Russia has long allied itself with Iran and has supported its malign behavior across the region and beyond, just as the United States and our partners have coalesced in opposition to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its violation of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, so too must we unite against Iran in support of our regional partners, including Israel and the Gulf states, whose territory and citizens are constantly under threat from Iran and its proxies. A vast majority of U.S. partners and allies in the region stood together at the United Nations in voting to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. However, when it came to suspending Russia's right of membership at the Human Rights Council, a significant number of countries in the region chose to abstain. And I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about Russia's shifting diplomatic influence in the Middle East, the role that countries in the MENA region can or should play to further isolate Russia, and the impact that these challenges will have on U.S. foreign policy. Again, I thank our witnesses for being here. I'm grateful for our friends from the Ukrainian Parliament who are here, and I will now yield to Ranking Member Wilson for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Ted Deutch. And Chairman Deutch, I want you to know how grateful we are for your leadership, what a difference you've made as you're concluding your service in Congress. You've made such a positive difference, and particularly we can see the positive difference that you've made recently with the additional funding for the people of Ukraine to show our affection for the people of Ukraine, and how fitting to have a delegation of the Ukrainian parliament present, because they should know that Americans are united to send a message to the people of Ukraine that we appreciate their resolve, their courage, and a message to Putin that indeed he is sacrificing young Russians solely for the benefit of his personal aggrandizement of oil and money and power. And so what a time for all of us to come together. And I appreciate this hearing in particular about Putin's war in Ukraine and the consequence in the Middle East, North Africa region. Sadly, we see example of Putin's maniacal destabilization goals exemplified through his involvement in the Middle East and North Africa. The world is in a conflict between democracy with rule of law opposed by authoritarians with rule of gun. There is the sad sequence developing of Putin invading Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, with the Chinese Communist Party invading Taiwan, as Iran seeks to vaporize Israel and India is destabilized. We must all stand firm. The world has witnessed Putin's murderous atrocities in Syria as Putin props up the butcher Bashar al-Assad in his continued war on his own people who desire a democratic and free Syria. The images of bombed out hospitals and schools in Ukraine are a mirror image of what we have witnessed in Syria at Aleppo. Without Putin, Assad could not have been able to carry out atrocities on the scale that have been witnessed. This unholy alliance is critical for Putin to maintain a footprint in the region. Utilizing Khmeimim and the naval base at Tartus, Russia's only overseas naval facility outside of the former Soviet borders, Putin stages exercises and projects power in the Mediterranean. In Libya, Russia continues its support of warlord Khalifa Haftar and further destabilizing a country trying to rebuild. I was grateful to lead the Libya Stabilization Act with Chairman Ted Deutch to hold Russia accountable for its malign actions in Libya. Putin's murderous Wagner Group is deployed across war zones in the Middle East, aligned with authoritarian regimes, wreaking havoc and committing human rights violations. It remains to be seen how Putin's war in Ukraine has affected Wagner Group's deployments across the MENA region. A critical sequence of Putin's war is the effect on the global wheat supply. More than 1/4 of the world's wheat come from Russia and Ukraine, with Ukraine's harvest season nearing. Incredibly, 80% of the wheat imported by Egypt is from Ukraine. Putin's war has shut down ports, displaced farmers, severely jeopardized the forecast for exportable wheat. The effects of this are obvious to the entire region and to the MENA as a top customer. As Putin has revealed himself to be the destabilizing actor that he is, creating opportunities for the United States to step in as the more reliable alternative with regards to security assistance. The United States should continue to leverage sanctions imposed on Russian arms sales, and by encouraging MENA countries to enact their sanctions to prevent their countries from becoming a haven for dirty money that fuels Putin's war. Make no mistake, Putin's goals are insidious. He seeks to establish reliance and extort countries to do his bidding. A bizarre beneficiary of the changing energy landscape will undoubtedly be Iran. With the administration's inclination to lift sanctions on the regime in Tehran and our effort to return to the disastrous JCPOA, we will see other countries follow China's lead in importing Iranian oil to fuel the destruction of Israel. I thank our witnesses for their time and expertise, and I look forward to hearing from you. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Thanks again to our witnesses for being here today. Let me remind the witnesses to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your written statements will be made a part of the hearing record. I will now introduce our witnesses. Dr. Hannah Nada is a senior research associate with the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Nonproliferation, focusing on arms control and security issues involving Russia, the Middle East, their intersection, and implications for U.S. and European policy. She completed her doctorate at Oxford University in 2018 on the topic of U.S.-Russian cooperation in the Middle East. She is fluent in Russian and Arabic. She's a German national residing in Berlin and Vienna. Her contributions have appeared in Foreign Policy, The Washington Post, War on the Rocks, and Carnegie, among others. Dr. Frederick Wary is a senior fellow in the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he focuses on geopolitics, security, and governance in Libya, North Africa, and the Gulf. He has testified before the U.S. Senate and House on multiple occasions, served as a consultant to the United Nations and other international organizations. And prior to joining Carnegie, he served for 21 years in the active and reserve components of the U.S. Air Force, with tours across the Middle East and Africa. He holds a doctorate from the University of Oxford and a master's degree from Princeton University. Ms. Caitlin Welsh is the director of the Global Food Security Program at the Center for Strategic International Studies, where she provides insight and policy solutions to global and U.S. food security challenges. She brings over a decade of U.S. government experience to this role, serving most recently on the National Security Council and National Economic Council as Director of Global Economic Engagement, where she coordinated U.S. policy in the G7 and G20. Prior to the White House, Ms. Welsh spent over 7 years in the Department of State's Office of Global Food Security, including as acting director, offering guidance to the Secretary of State on global food security. And finally, Mr. Grant Rumley is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy's program on Great Power Competition in the Middle East, where he specializes in military and security affairs in the Middle East. From 2018 to 2021, Grant served in both the Trump and Biden administrations as an advisor for Middle East policy in the Office of Secretary of Defense, Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and prior to joining OSD, Mr. Rumley was a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where his research focused on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As we can see, we have an esteemed group of witnesses today. I thank all of them for being here. I will now recognize the witnesses for 5 minutes each, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made a part of the record. Dr. Nada, you're recognized.
Chairman Deutch, Ranking Member Wilson, members of the subcommittee, members of the Ukrainian Parliament, thanks very much for inviting me to participate in today's hearing. My name is Hanna Notte. I'm a senior research associate at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, and I'm here to speak solely on my own behalf. As Russia settles into a protracted war of aggression against Ukraine, the ripple effects are being felt across the Middle East. High energy and food prices are just one example. So what should we expect regarding Russia's role in the MENA region going forward? It has been my assessment, which was reaffirmed in conversations I had in Moscow just days before the invasion of Ukraine, that Russia's approach to the region has settled into a stable modus operandi in recent years. First, Moscow's military presence in Syria has given it a buffer zone on its southern flank to counter perceived threats from within the region, but also to deter NATO outside the European theater. And second, Russia has turned to the region to diversify its economic relations with a focus on arms sales, civilian nuclear exports, and wheat supplies. And in building influence, Russia has largely followed what I'd call a low-cost, high-disruption approach, also using hybrid tactics such as private military companies and disinformation. Now, these Russian interests in the region will not fundamentally change with the invasion of Ukraine. Today, Russia's regional diplomacy remains highly active, aimed at offsetting the impact of Western sanctions and demonstrating that Moscow is not isolated internationally. However, I would expect Russia's activities to be accompanied by a certain military risk aversion, for instance, vis-à-vis US forces in Syria, while the bulk of its military remains consumed in Ukraine. It wants to preserve existing gains in Syria. Now let me turn to the question of Russian cooperation in specific areas. Starting with arms control and non-proliferation, though Moscow seemed intent on spoiling negotiations to restore the JCPOA in early March, it subsequently dropped demands for written guarantees that its cooperation with Tehran would not be hindered by sanctions imposed over Ukraine. But still, I think the geopolitical situation might make Moscow less willing to help finalize a nuclear deal. As in the past, Russia is also unlikely to support any US efforts to curb Iran's use of missiles and proxies in the region, because essentially Iran's regional strategy pins down US resources while elevating Russia as a regional mediator, which serves Russian interests well. Just a few words on the implications of Russia's nuclear saber rattling over Ukraine for proliferation trends in the region. I think those will require careful monitoring. Regional countries took note of a nuclear weapon state using veiled nuclear threats to deter the conventional defense of a non-nuclear weapon state, and they will reflect what this precedent means for their own security. Just a few words on Syria. Security Council Resolution 2585 on the provision of humanitarian aid to northwest Syria is up for renewal in July. Now, rationally speaking, the Kremlin should cooperate to avoid a worsening of Syria's food crisis, especially if an endgame in Ukraine remains out of reach. But considering the current level of tensions between Russia and the West, I think the United States should be prepared for a Russian Security Council veto regardless, alongside continued Russian stalling on the Syrian Constitutional Committee. Moscow has no serious interest in seeing the committee advance. It will instead try to foster a Gulf Arab counterweight to Iran in Syria through normalization, especially for the contingency that Russia may need to scale back its own presence in Syria due to Ukraine. Now let me finally turn to some views on the Ukraine war from within the MENA region. First, unfortunately, I think there's a widespread perception that the Ukraine war is not their war, that it's a great power NATO-Russia war, partially fueled by NATO and US actions vis-à-vis Russia. Second, there are accusations of Western double standards. The military support to Kiev, the reception of Ukrainian refugees, these are rightly or wrongly viewed as proof that the West cares significantly more about conflicts in Europe's neighborhood than those in the Middle East. Third, regional elites worry about US conventional security guarantees. They fear that the threats posed by Russia and China will accelerate a decline in US power in the Middle East. And they also fear that the US will have limited bandwidth to confront Iran's missile and proxy activities. And with those fears, they feel they cannot afford to put all their eggs into the US basket. And then finally, each regional state has very distinct business and security interests with Russia. As a result, and I'll end here, I think US opportunities to get regional states to turn against Russia are circumscribed. Loosening these ties that states have been building with Russia will require a heavy lift, a US regional strategy that is both comprehensive and specific. Comprehensive in addressing those threat perceptions that have led regional countries to seek diversified great power relations in the first place, and specific in mitigating each country's distinct interests in doing business with Russia. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nada. Next, Dr. Wary, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Deutch, Ranking Member Wilson, members of the subcommittee, members of the Ukrainian Parliament, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you here today about how Russia's invasion of Ukraine has impacted Russian arms sales and other military activities in the Middle East and North Africa. I join you remotely from Tripoli, Libya, a city that bore the brunt of a Russian military assault in the form of hundreds of mercenaries from the Wagner Group who were backing a Libyan warlord in a bid to topple the Libyan government. While this assault failed, it caused thousands of deaths and it left deep political divisions in its wake. Moreover, thousands of Wagner personnel and advanced Russian weaponry remain entrenched across Libya. In many respects, Russia's Libya campaign epitomizes its renewed activism across the Middle East, which has included military intervention, arms sales, grain exports, diplomatic mediation and a willingness to talk to all sides, energy and infrastructure projects, and propaganda and media. This engagement is largely opportunistic and ad hoc. It seizes on instability and power vacuums. It exploits the insecurities of US partners in the region about the reliability of US support and their displeasure with the conditionality that the US sometimes attaches to its arms sales. Russian arms deliveries, in contrast, are faster and free from restrictions related to human rights, but Russia cannot provide the security guarantees that many Arab states have depended on from the United States. Now, in the wake of its invasion of Ukraine, Russia is trying to reap dividends from its investment in the region, call in favors, and capitalize on local ambivalence and hostility to the United States, both from states and from Arab publics. America's Arab security partners have deferred on joining the Western condemnation of Russian aggression and some have refused to join efforts to isolate Russia economically. Meanwhile, Russia is trying to divert Wagner forces and Syrian militia fighters to Ukraine from both Syria and Libya. But both the scale and military significance of this deployment should not be overstated. The actual number of Syrians who've arrived in Ukraine is unclear, and Libyan contacts with first-hand knowledge have told me that thousands of Wagner troops still remain very much present in Libya. On top of this, these mercenaries and the Syrian fighters will find a vastly more capable foe in Ukraine than the ones they previously fought. More importantly, Russia's disastrous war in Ukraine is tarnishing its reputation as an arms supplier in the Middle East. Russian weapons have been shown to be flawed in combat, and often fatally so. Battlefield expenditures and attrition have whittled away Russia's inventory, especially precision munitions. And sanctions have eroded its defense industrial base, especially electronic components. As a result, Russia won't be able to fulfill its existing commitments, and potential buyers will be increasingly dissuaded from turning to Russia. This shortfall could be modestly exploited by China, which possesses large quantities of Russian-made arms and spare parts, which it could use to keep existing inventories in the region up and running. China could also intensify its efforts to sell its own advanced weaponry, like drones. Now, in response to this new landscape, the US should avoid trying to coax its Arab partners back into the fold with promises of more weapons and more formal security commitments. Neither Russia nor China can really flip any state in this region into its orbit. And for too long, Arab regimes, especially Arab autocrats, have cleverly courted assistance from Moscow and Beijing to extract arms deals from Washington and to obtain leniency on human rights. Instead of taking this bait, the US should amplify the effects of Russia's diminished reputation as an arms provider, while also using financial sanctions, and especially the more effective and consistent application of the 2017 CAATSA sanctions to constrain Russian arms flows. The US should also try to fill its partners' legitimate defense needs with transfers of its own, or through European partners or regional producers like Turkey or Israel. But the US shouldn't let this charged moment of great power rivalry distract it from focusing on the daunting socioeconomic and political problems that the Middle East and its societies face. These problems include authoritarian governance and corruption, the fallout from the pandemic, and of course, food insecurity arising from the Ukraine war, climate change, the looming end of the hydrocarbon era, and the lack of opportunities, economic opportunities, to name but a few. These problems present a far more pressing threat to both long-term stability and to US interests than any encroachment by Moscow or Beijing, for that matter. They demand a fresh, holistic approach from the US rather than a return to the overly securitized policies that have defined the American presence in the Middle East for decades. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you here today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wary. Ms. Welsh, you're recognized.
Chairman Deutch, Ranking Member Wilson, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and welcome to members of the Ukrainian Parliament. Following is a summary of my written testimony, which I have submitted to the committee. Russia's invasion of Ukraine leaves few agricultural markets untouched and threatens food security for millions in and outside the Black Sea. The war has reduced supplies and increased prices of foods exported from Ukraine and Russia, namely wheat, maize, and sunflower oil, driven up demand for substitute products, and reduced fertilizer exports from the Black Sea. Today's high cost of energy puts further pressure on food and fertilizer prices. Most vulnerable to the impacts of these price spikes are countries for whom wheat is a major source of calories, that rely on imports to meet their food security needs, and that source a significant proportion of their imports from Ukraine and Russia. This characterizes many countries in the Middle East and North Africa. Levels of food insecurity caused by this war and appropriate policy responses differ depending on context. For example, Egypt is the world's largest importer of wheat, sourcing over 70% of its wheat from the Black Sea, which presents problems for its budget. Egypt spends about $3 billion annually for wheat imports, and over $3.2 billion on its bread subsidy program. Experts recommend that Egypt diversify its sources of wheat imports, reduce per capita consumption of bread, more efficiently target its food subsidy program, and adapt its agriculture sector to water shortages and climate-related threats. The Russia-Ukraine war is raising the cost of food at a time of extreme food insecurity amid the civil war in Yemen, where over half the population are food insecure, including over 30,000 in famine-like conditions. Yemen relies on imports to meet its food needs. The total value of food imports exceeds the value of all exports from Yemen. Emergency aid is critical to addressing levels of food insecurity there, and it is particularly important to maintain the value of cash transfers in the face of high inflation. The Russia-Ukraine war is limiting access to wheat for Lebanon, already in one of the worst economic crises in the world. Lebanon has not recorded economic growth since 2017, and food price inflation reached 400% in December 2021. Lebanon procures approximately 75% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine, and experts recommend Lebanon shore up wheat supplies for the near term and ensure equitable distribution of bread through social safety net programs and rebuild its grain silos to insulate itself and perhaps other countries in the region from supply and price shocks. And although Gulf countries import up to 90% of their food, including from the Black Sea, they have thus far weathered the agriculture market impacts of Russia's war in Ukraine. A range of efforts have bolstered food security in the GCC, whose countries are also benefiting from high oil prices. Still, analysts recommend GCC countries encourage domestic agricultural production, invest in agricultural companies, and build and maintain food reserves to buffer the effects of future crises. Some policy prescriptions differ country to country based on context, while others are recommended broadly. Refrain from imposing export bans, avoid hoarding and panic buying, continue to exempt food and fertilizer from sanctions, and provide humanitarian assistance through the UN World Food Program. The US and global responses to the food security impacts of Russia's war are still unfolding. Today and tomorrow, Secretary Blinken will host 2 meetings on this exact topic at the UN in New York. G7 development, health, and finance ministers are meeting in Germany this week and discussing solutions to food insecurity caused by this war. And 2 days ago, Secretary Yellen announced actions from international financial institutions to address this crisis. In the 2015 Intelligence Community Assessment on Global Food Security, the IC warned that, and this is a quote, large exportable supplies of key components of food production come from states where conflict and government actions could cause supply chain disruptions that lead to price spikes. In years to come, conflict, climate change, and other factors will continue to affect food security, particularly in the MENA region. In their responses to today's global food crises, policymakers would be wise to consider investing in mechanisms that help food importing countries weather today's and future supply and price shocks. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Welsh. And Mr. Rumley, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Deutch, Ranking Member Wilson, members of the subcommittee, members of the Ukrainian Parliament, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the issue of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its impact on the Middle East and North Africa. I'm honored to be included alongside such distinguished scholars. Russia is one of the few countries in the world to maintain a relatively positive diplomatic standing with nearly every country in the Middle East. It does so through a combination of an active military presence, high-level diplomatic engagement, and a concerted effort to position itself as a viable source of arms should countries seek non-U.S. material. Russia's military presence in the region is well documented. By Russian MOD statements, Russia has deployed over 60,000 troops to Syria since intervening in 2015. From its 2 bases in Syria, Hmeimim and Tartus, Russia is able to project power into the eastern Mediterranean, influence the course of the Syrian civil war, and intervene in countries like Libya. Russia complements this military posture with an active and often effective arms sales pitch across the region, often seeking to exploit gaps left by the U.S. Turkey's acquisition of the S-400 and Egypt's purchase of the Sukhoi 35 are well known, but others in the region continue to be interested in Russian material. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, however, threatens Russia's standing in the region. Already, reports indicate Russia has begun withdrawing some troops and mercenaries from the region to support its invasion of Ukraine. While we can expect these reports to continue if the war continues to go poorly for Russia, I'm skeptical of a full Russian withdrawal, and instead expect Russia to continue to consolidate its forces until it's left with a skeleton presence at Hmeimim and Tartus, its most strategic assets in the region. On arms sales, the Russian defense industry, which has struggled to produce key platforms following sanctions initially placed after its 2014 invasion of Ukraine, will likely have to prioritize replenishing the Russian military over exporting. Further, customers of Russian arms may struggle with the resources to maintain and sustain the material in their inventory. Still, so long as Russia is able to make platforms, there will likely always be potential customers of Russian arms. Given all this, I recommend the U.S. consider the following steps. First, clarify the U.S. policy regarding the implementation of CAATSA. I know the CAATSA debate in the U.S. usually pits delaying determination against issuing a waiver, but delaying determination only leaves partners more confused. Issuing a waiver sends a clear message to countries around the world as to what the U.S. sees as acceptable regarding a future relationship with Russia. Second, maintain the U.S. presence in northeast Syria. A diminished Russian presence may create a vacuum for ISIS. Additionally, a key Russian demand in negotiations over Syria's future has been that all U.S. forces leave the country. As Russia's presence wanes on the ground, ours may grant us more leverage in negotiating over Syria's future. Third, proactively shape partner requests in order to explore enhanced production possibilities. Many of our partners in the Middle East and North Africa seek not only U.S. arms, but help in planning for a post-petroleum future. They seek technological sharing, co-production, and support for their own defense industrial base. By shaping multi-year acquisition strategies with partners individually, the U.S. can prioritize partner needs while also potentially opening the possibility for enhanced production capabilities. Provide off-ramps to countries in the middle of major arms transactions with Russia or who have recently purchased Russian systems. Turkey and Egypt are two examples of traditional U.S. partners with significant Russian arms in their inventories. There may now be a window to begin to wean them off Russian arms. Elsewhere in the world, the U.S. may also want to consider expanding the availability of foreign military financing to traditional Russian customers in order to lure them away from Russia. Prepare select platforms for simultaneous export in order to better compete with great power competitors. As drones increasingly populate the Middle East, a common complaint from partners is the lack of an exportable, effective U.S. counter-UAV platform, especially when Russia and China market one. To better compete with great power competitors, the U.S. must compete in this space as well. And finally, continue targeting Russian sanctions evasion efforts to ensure lasting impact to the Russian defense industry. In particular, this effort should focus on Chinese companies and the potential for China to supply Russia with dual-use components that may support its defense acquisitions. I thank you again for your time and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rumley, and thanks to all of the witnesses. I will now recognize members for 5 minutes each. Pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purpose of questioning our witnesses. Because of the hybrid format at this hearing, I will recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know so that we can come back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. I will defer my time until the end, and with that, recognize Mr. Cicilline for the purpose of questioning the witness.
Thank you, Chairman Deutch, and thank you to you and Ranking Member Wilson for holding today's hearing on this very important issue. And I, too, want to welcome our colleagues, members of the Ukrainian Parliament, and say that the Congress of the United States and the American people stand very firmly with the Ukrainian people in your fight for democracy, not only for your future, but for the future of democracy in the world. So it's an honor to have you with us. And thank you to our witnesses for your very compelling testimony. I want to begin with you, Ms. Welsh. I was in the region recently with the chairman and then with Senator Coons and met with David Beasley of the World Food Program, and he provided a similar kind of very daunting and terrifying future in terms of food insecurity, and particularly with what was happening at the port of Odessa, where food is just apparently going to rot because the Russians won't let it be offloaded. So I'm wondering what, and you also spoke about the fertilizer shortage, so it's not only the immediate food insecurity, but it's also the ability to plant for the next season. what should we be doing in addition to obviously providing additional resources to programs like the World Food Program? What else can Congress do to mitigate the impact, both in the short term and the long term, of this really devastating impact on food security in the region?
Thank you for that question, for an excellent question. I'll note that the worst impacts, I think, are still to come. The restrictions that we've seen in exports are exports from the last season's harvest. The current season is still in the ground, ready for harvest in the coming months. The USDA put out its first estimate of the proportion of that harvest that will not be able to be exported, and they estimated a reduction of over 11 million metric tons of wheat from Ukraine that won't be able to make it out of Ukraine. So I think that effects will continue, at least in the medium term. In addition to providing robust financing for WFP, which I sense Congress is willing to do, I think it's incredibly important to continue to do that, not only for those who are immediately impacted in Ukraine and by this crisis, but for those who are experiencing acute food insecurity absent this crisis in the Horn of Africa, in the Sahel region, et cetera. Also note that the World Food Program has estimated that because of this war, the cost of production for cost of operation for WFP have risen up to $23 billion per month. So I think it's incredibly important to continue robust financing for WFP. In addition to that, as I mentioned, we're in the midst of formulation of U.S. and global responses. In the long term, of course, it's very important to continue to invest in resilient agriculture, especially in the face of climate change. The way that I view this situation, though, is that apart from emergency assistance on the one hand and long-term assistance, which is agricultural development on the other hand, we need a financing facility to help food importing countries, perhaps those that are not experiencing the worst of this crisis, to afford the cost of imports. And I'm sensing that that is what Secretary Yellen was announcing with financing from the IFIs on Monday, and that is also what we could expect to hear out of the G7 in June.
Thank you. Dr. Nadi, earlier this year, I joined Chairman Meeks and Chairman Deutch, along with others, urging the Biden administration to continue its efforts to restore human rights as a vital pillar in our bilateral relationships with Egypt. And I'm wondering if you could comment on how you see Russia's invasion of Ukraine affecting U.S.-Egyptian bilateral relations, and what opportunities does the administration have to deepen these ties, and how do we do so while also honoring our commitment to human rights? And also, how does Egypt perceive Russia in terms of its strategic partnership, and has that changed since their brutal, barbaric invasion of Ukraine?
Thank you very much for the question, Congressman. I think the first thing here to say is that while Egyptian-Russian relations go way back by decades, the Soviet Union had a stake in Egypt and important relations, one really shouldn't overstate the depth and the importance of the Egyptian-Russian relationship. There are some trade relations. There are the wheat supplies, that is true. Russia intends to build a nuclear power plant at Al-Dab'a in Egypt. So that is certainly sort of a strategic area where the Russians want to position themselves. And then there are the occasional arms sales to Egypt in an Egyptian effort to diversify its arms procurement. But the relationship hasn't really evolved much beyond that. One should also say, I think, that Egypt has looked favorably somewhat upon Russia's role in Libya, seeing Russia and its partnership with General Haftar sort of as a sort of guarantee that the Egyptian-Libyan border remains somewhat stable. The Egyptians have looked towards the Russians to ensure that. Now, when it comes to sort of undermining Russian commercial opportunities in Egypt with the Al-Dab'a power plant, I think countries in the region might well doubt that Rosatom, which is the company that is building those power plants, can be an attractive provider in the future. Rosatom hasn't been sanctioned yet, but the companies that usually, the banks that provide loans for those power plants, like Sberbank, when it comes to the Turkish power plant, Akuyu, have been sanctioned. And also a nuclear power plant is a decades-long investment, and there might well be doubts about Russia's ability to service and maintain strategic technologies, whether it's arms or whether it's nuclear power plants in the future. So I would actually expect a certain hesitancy by countries like Egypt to procure these strategic technologies from Russia going forward. And I think the United States should make clear those limitations of the Russians in their own bilateral consultations with the Egyptians.
Thank you so much. My time has expired. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Wilson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And indeed, as we have our visiting parliamentarians from Ukraine, what an extraordinary time in history. You should be aware. I appreciate the leadership of Chairman Ted Deutch assisting in the $40 billion aid package. That's the largest package that truly has ever occurred so quickly because it's done heartfelt. And then I'm really grateful that as our parliamentarians, if you have a chance to travel across the United States, you're going to find out something, and that is that on virtually every street, there is a flag of Ukraine in front of 1, 2, 3 homes. And then I'm really grateful that I was able to provide a flag of Ukraine when you visit the State House in South Carolina and you visit with the governor, Henry McMaster, who's a strong friend of Ukraine. The first thing you're going to see when you get to the office is the flag of Ukraine. So you are thought of, your courage. From our perspective, it's don't tread on me, live free or die, the American Revolution. With that, a question for Mr. Rumley. What factors do you think would assist in deterring U.S. partners from purchasing Russian military equipment? What can we do to prevent China from backfilling the defense procurement space that may be vacated by Russia in the Middle East?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. I definitely think customers of Russian arms are going to have several hurdles going forward, not only with simply maintaining and sustaining what they've already purchased, but in some of the basic logistics, even the payment process. A Russian bank complained last month that it wasn't able to process close to $1 billion in payments from India and Egypt over arms sales. I think countries that purchase Russian arms will also now have to consider the potential that they may incur secondary sanctions in addition to running afoul of CATSA. I think from our standpoint, there are many ways that we can amend our security cooperation approach. The Middle East, I think, is a key theater for the future of great power competition. Not only have we been competing with Russia in terms of arms sales there, but China increasingly has sold armed drones to the region. They've sold it to traditional partners, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE. And what they're doing is oftentimes what we're not willing to do. Our partners in the region seek co-production. They seek technology sharing. China and Russia are willing to work together to build these advanced platforms. Russia and the UAE inked an agreement several years ago to produce a 5th-generation fighter. Nothing's come of that yet. China and Saudi Arabia, however, signed an agreement a couple months ago to jointly produce armed drones in Saudi Arabia. And so I think the U.S. may want to think creatively in terms of both what we sell, how we sell it, and what we're doing to make this more of a relationship and something beyond a strict transaction.
Putin uses the base in Syria to challenge NATO's southern flank, a direct threat to Turkey, to Greece, to Bulgaria, to Albania, to Italy. Can you provide more information on how Russia uses this base to challenge NATO? You detailed how Russia's military presence in Syria supports Russia's power projection. Is there anything the United States can do to limit the Russian presence in Syria and therefore their projection in the region?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. Their presence in Syria has evolved from a modest airstrip in 2015 to a base at Humaymim that by open source reporting can serve as a logistics hub, a medical hub. It has the runways to host Russia's most advanced bombers. There was reports before Ukraine that Russia was deploying Tu-22 bombers there and hypersonic missiles. Their facility at Tartus likewise has their ability to stage naval assets there has expanded. They can now stage up to 11 ships there. So it has grown from a rather modest beginning to something much more, I think, challenging from a U.S. standpoint. In terms of what we can do, I think we can continue to support Ukraine and the defense of Ukraine. And the longer that Russia is bogged down in Ukraine, the harder it will be for Russia's military to extend and maintain its presence in the Middle East.
Disappointed to hear that Russia has a 5-year agreement with Egypt to use its air bases and airspace. How utilized is this agreement by the Russian Federation and in the last 5 years, and what factors will influence Egypt's decision of whether to renew the agreement?
Thank you, Congressman. I think Dr. Wary might be able to provide some details as well here. I think from Egypt's standpoint, the Basin Agreement fits into both their shared objectives with Russia in terms of intervening in the Libya conflict. I think it also fits into their diversification since President Sisi came to power of seeking to diversify both who they buy from, but also who they jointly cooperate with on a military front. I think I can't say for certain whether they will renew it. I know there's the option to automatically renew the agreement, but again, the effects of Ukraine may make it difficult for Russia to maintain much of a presence there.
Input in the future, Egypt should be such an important part of stability in the Middle East and a strong ally of the United States. So any way we can back them up to not be reliant on anything that relates to Putin. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member and yield 5 minutes to Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So obviously for a lot of countries in the Middle East and North Africa, the war in Ukraine has brought significant economic challenges, food insecurity. For example, countries like Egypt and Libya, Yemen, Tunisia. But for other countries, particularly from some of the oil-rich countries in the Persian Gulf, the war, from everything I can see, has brought nothing but economic benefits that they've taken advantage of. Right now, there is a shortage of about 1.5 million barrels a day of oil on the global markets, if you count the Russian oil that has been lost due to sanctions, and then throw in what we have generated additionally from our strategic reserves. And all the experts I've spoken to tell me there are only 2 countries in the world that have the capacity to make up that shortfall in a short period of time, and that's Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And yet they seem to have made a deliberate choice now for several months not to use that power to stabilize these global energy markets. And they've made a lot of money out of this. Saudi Arabia's Aramco, for example, the state-owned oil company, in the first quarter of 2022, made a profit of $40 billion in comparison to $22 billion in the first quarter of the previous year. That's a 124% increase, an $18 billion windfall from basically the increased oil prices from the Ukraine war. By refusing to play their role, they have enabled Russia to make a lot more money because the price of oil is higher on their remaining oil exports, and they have seriously hurt the United States and our Western European allies. All of our constituents are feeling this right now. They have made it extremely hard for us, harder than it otherwise would have been, to impose the types of sanctions on Russian energy that are needed to bring this war to an end. So I wanted to ask you, Mr. Wary, I mean, first of all, can you think of any countries in the world that are doing more to undermine our sanctions on Russia than Saudi Arabia and the UAE? And 2, why are they doing this? What are the concessions that they're trying to extract from us as part of this process?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I think you raise a very important point about the nature of our partnership with these 2 states and the idea that because of the Ukraine war, we should redouble our efforts to solidify those partnerships, especially in terms of security and arms. I think we need to question what that partnership has gotten us in the region to begin with. We've sold these countries arms. They've used arms in ways that have been destabilizing in the region, that have killed civilians. In many cases, these arms are bought purely for prestige or used for domestic repression. Simply selling arms to these countries often doesn't give the U.S. leverage. So the entire range of security outcomes from our giving arms to them, really hasn't gotten us anything. And now, of course, you raised the issue of oil. They are not coming on board with us here. There's a whole list of, logic. They've got relationships with China. They're trying to extract more guarantees from us. I mean, the United Arab Emirates have demanded a formal security pact from the United States. And so that goes to my earlier point in my statement that these states have seized upon this moment, this very charged moment of great power rivalry, and they're trying to manipulate it. They're trying to extract as much as they can from us. And I do think we need to, frankly speaking, call them on their bluff. Russia and China are not going to step in and defend these countries from Iranian missiles. They're not going to play the role. I think the U.S. has to be comfortable with a degree of security diversification in the region, a degree of multipolarity.
Yeah, I mean, doesn't it, just have a few seconds left, but I mean, doesn't this raise the question of who is the superpower in this relationship, right? Are we leveraging them, or are they able to leverage us? I mean, I recall President Trump actually got the Saudis to pump less oil in 2020 by threatening to pull our troops out of the kingdom. And it took basically a few days to get that concession once he was willing to play that card. I mean, and it has taken us months this year, so far unsuccessfully, to get a similar result by different means. So what lesson do you draw from that?
Well, I think you're right, Congressman. We have still enormous cards we can play in terms of the defense that we're providing them, in terms of the systems that we put on their soil. There is a naval patrol that we just agreed to with the Saudis. So, I mean, we're already doing so much. We do have enormous cards, and we are the superpower. We need to start acting like it, and we need to be confident in doing so, I think. And we still have seniority in the relationship, to answer your question.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Stubbe is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions are for Mr. Rumley. Israel has publicly condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine through announcements and votes in international settings. Israel also sought to provide political support and humanitarian relief for the Ukrainians, including allowing over 15,000 Jewish and non-Jewish refugees to enter Israel without alienating Russia. In some instances, Israel officials served as communicators between their Russian and Ukrainian counterparts. Since 2015, Russia's military presence and air defense capabilities in Syria have given it influence over Israel's ability to conduct airstrikes there. Israel has depended on access to Syrian airspace to target Iranian personnel and equipment, especially those related to the transport of munitions or precision weapons technology to Hezbollah and Lebanon. How has Russia repositioned its forces in the Middle East since the start of the Ukrainian conflict?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. We've seen reports that Russia has repositioned its forces in the region, mostly consolidated into air bases, pulling out from sort of different parts of the country, I think further in the east. It's hard to verify these reports as they all are open source, but I think your question is an important one because it gets at Israel's equities in Syria and its relationship with Russia. And I think we can't underscore enough just how much the IL-20 shootdown in 2018 impacted both the Israeli military, but also the Israeli security leadership today. Israel's priority is freedom of action in Syria and maintaining freedom of action in Syria in order to destabilize Iran's activities there, Iran's ability to support its proxies in Lebanon and Hezbollah. And so I think Israel has to navigate that fine balance with Russia, as Russia has deployed S-300s in support of Bashar al-Assad and S-400s in support of its own premium assets. So it is certainly a fine line, and I think we've seen Israeli policy from the start of Ukraine reflect that.
Currently, 5 countries operate in or maintain military forces in Syria: Russia, Turkey, Iran, Israel, and the United States. The Assad government, backed by Russia and Iran and aligned military forces, controls about 2/3 of Syria's territory, including most of the major cities. Russia's military influence also extends to North Africa. The Syrian regime also helps funnel money back to Russian oligarchs. How have Russian partners like Iran and Assad responded to redeployments in the region?
Thank you, Congressman. Yeah, I think what we're very likely to see is where Russia repositions and withdraws, Iran and its proxies will look to fill that vacuum. I think that's, going back to my remarks, what makes our presence in northeastern Syria all the more important, both to ensure that any withdrawal doesn't create a vacuum that ISIS and its elements can exploit, but also that we could be there to monitor and potentially disrupt Iranian activities to fill that vacuum. And so I think given the strain placed on the Russian forces, it's likely we're going to see a more active Iranian activity in the region.
Former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had a close working relationship with Vladimir Putin, and the two leaders maintained a hotline which allowed the Israeli military to alert Russian forces of incoming strikes in Syria. However, it's clear that even before Russia's war with Ukraine, Putin and Israel's new Prime Minister, Bennett, do not share the same relationship. Russia's assistance to Syrian force in intercepting Israeli missiles in July of 2021 demonstrates this. So how do the security dynamics in Syria impact Israel's approach to Ukraine with respect to Russia?
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you, Congressman. I think it's clear that so long as Russia has its air defense systems in Syria in support of Bashar al-Assad, it will maintain some form of leverage over Israel's ability to conduct operations in Syria and strike back at that Iranian infrastructure. I think that I can't speak to the Bennett-Putin relationship, but I do think it's a combination both of navigating that dynamic in Syria, but also him being relatively new. The Putin-Netanyahu relationship had many years to develop, and so I think it was both probably not great timing for Bennett to inherit this crisis, but I think we're going to continue to see Israel navigate a fine line in its relationship with Russia.
I've got a couple of seconds left real quick. What are the risks to Israel's security by supporting Ukraine against the Russian invasion?
Yes, Congressman, there's always the risk that is ever present on Israel's mind that Russia may turn on its air defense systems and begin to attempt to deny Israel freedom of action in Syria.
Thanks for your time here today.
Thank you, Mr. Stubbe. I will yield myself time for personal questioning. Let me start with Dr. Nada. I wanted to follow up, Dr. Nada, on your reference to Russia's veiled nuclear threats and ask what is it that you believe, how is it that you believe that will impact the Middle East in particular? And can you speak to those nuclear threats and the possibility of tactical nuclear strikes by Russia and the impact on proliferation in the Middle East region?
Thank you for the question, Chairman. I think at this point, one can only speak anecdotally and somewhat speculatively to the impact that this nuclear saber rattling over Ukraine has for the region. I can certainly share that regional interlocutors have taken note of this threat and are really asking, is this a safe world to live in where some countries have nuclear weapons and those that do not have them can be coerced, can be blackmailed, and can be the victim of a conventional aggression without someone coming to their aid? And I think it's the combination of those threats and how they are perceived in the region, plus the worry about a growing Iranian nuclear threat, which many in the region believe will not be mitigated even if we have a restoration of the JCPOA. Many believe that Iran might end up with a threshold nuclear capability anyway, and then it's just one step away from weaponization. So it's really the combination of those two factors, and they worry that the United States might have insufficient bandwidth to give those, assurances to those countries to mitigate that threat, that I think sort of gets them thinking. I'm not prepared to say today that on that basis, countries have concluded to, pursue an own nuclear program or a nuclear option hedging, but I do believe that it is something that capitals will consider.
And And you referenced the bandwidth issue of the United States and questions about the perception of what that bandwidth might be and whether it's great enough. I want to follow up with specifically with a question about Russia and the comment that actually I think Dr. Wary and Mr. Rumley, you both spoke to this, the failure of the Russian invasion to roll through Ukraine, the challenges that the Russian military has had, show the limit of Russia's military capability. And for countries in the MENA region, that may have looked, well, they previously looked to Russia as a potential security partner, one who is less demanding, as I think a couple of you said, than the U.S. may be. How is their failure in Ukraine being perceived, and how can the United States capitalize on the failures of Russia and Ukraine to show that the United States, including our values, remain a dedicated ally to Middle Eastern countries? Mr. Rumley, we'll start with you, then go to Dr. Wary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that's absolutely right. I think for potential customers and current customers of Russian arms in the Middle East right now, assuming you're able to maintain and sustain what you've bought, you're assuming Russia's going to be able to build and even export future material, and assuming you'll be able to pay for it, I think there will still be some appetite in the region for Russian arms. I think Middle East partners and partners globally will distinguish between the way Russia has used its forces and the standalone capabilities of some of these platforms. I think also the prices for these may drop dramatically in the future, and so there are likely always going to be customers out there looking for cheap arms that come with less perceived strings attached to it. I think the U.S. has several partners in the middle of major Russian arms purchases that we can, like Turkey in the S-400 that has requested the F-16, or Egypt in the Sukhoi 35 that has requested the F-15. I'm not saying we have to sort of make a deal right now for that, but I think it's clear that these countries are going to have gaps in their capabilities where they had planned on having Russian platforms to complement, and we can work with our partners and work with our own defense industry and see if there's ways in which we can provide off-ramps for them to gradually disinvest these Russian platforms.
I thank you. Dr. Wary, you had said earlier that Russia can't really offer security guarantees and that the weapons aren't good. Do you want to speak to that?
Right. Thank you for the question. It's pursued really a sort of transactional commercial approach. It hasn't, and I think states in the region have responded. They haven't moved, their relationships with Russia to the sorts of relationships that really define alliances and partnerships. They haven't opened up access to bases a lot of times, and so I think it's a mutual understanding. When countries in the region buy U.S. arms, they believe they're buying much more than the capability, the hardware, that they're purchasing an insurance policy, right? And I think especially for states in the Gulf, there's a fundamental sense of insecurity. These are states that face Iran, but they're also autocrats. I mean, they're insecure because of their political systems. They face dissent from within. We saw that with Egypt, and so they're purchasing a whole stream of U.S. assurances. They believe they are, and Russia's not going to come in and replace that. It's not going to, even the U.S. isn't. So again, I think in light of its disastrous performance in Ukraine, and to be clear, there have been other instances in Crimea where Russian hardware was also shown to be defective. But I think this is of a qualitatively different level. The U.S. needs to let this speak for itself. And as my co-panelist mentioned, I do think there is an opportunity to help wean partners off of Russian systems through co-production, through alternative, suppliers. We need to provide that opening for them, but we shouldn't get back into the arms race game. I think we need to, keep our eye on the long-term problems in the region, which, as I mentioned, are enormous and relate to governance and economy.
Thank you, Dr. Wary. I have I have a number of questions on food security issues for Ms. Welsh, but I'm going to yield to Mr. Perry next, and we'll come back to Ms. Welsh on the next go. Mr. Perry, you're recognized.
I thank the chairman. Sorry to be late. Other things going on. To the witnesses, good to see you. I think my question is probably for Mr. Rumley. Instead of reading all this, I know you talked about off-ramps, or at least I suspect you did, even though I wasn't here. You know, we just passed $40 billion in a Ukraine assistance package, and I think that we're depleting our own supply of javelins and stingers. They're not being produced, as far as I know, or if there are not much capacity. So we're reducing our own stockpile at this very moment. In that context, what do you think is the scope of your proposed expansion to the foreign military financing program, and how would you square your off-ramps for the additional countries with our shortages? So you're talking about adding additional countries. Meanwhile, we're depleting what we have based on the one country that's obviously being attacked and invaded right now militarily. But this puts the United States in a perilous position. We have to protect ourselves, right? I mean, you put your oxygen mask on first on the airplane before you put it on each other. There's a reason for that. It's a similar situation here.
Thank you, Congressman. The issue of co-production is one means, I think, to address a common complaint, which is buying from America takes too long, that it's too complicated, that if we get in line to buy something from the U.S., we're going to have to wait years to get it. A good example is the F-16. There are over 20 countries in the world that fly the F-16. We currently, Lockheed Martin builds it out of one facility. That facility, if you get in line today, you're probably not getting the F-16 for 5 years from when you sign on the dotted line for it. In the 70s and the 80s, we co-produced the F-16 with 3 other European countries, and we were able to get them off the line faster. The initial order at those facilities was for 1,000 F-16s. The initial order for the F-16 plant in South Carolina was for 90 F-16s for Taiwan and Morocco. And so from an industry standpoint, it's a question of scale. And so they're not able to, I think, ramp up the production, because while the demand may get closer to 1,000 over time, it's at 128 last I checked. It's not there yet. And so I think we can use foreign military financing, longer security cooperation planning, working with our partners on sort of multi-year acquisition timetables to then also communicate and send a message, send a signal to defense industry that these are orders for upgrades, for new kits that are going to come down the road. You can start to plan around that and potentially address some of these production lags.
So just being the devil's advocate in the conversation here, and being the guy that kind of sees that government creates something, there's a problem that government probably created, and then has the solution for it, which usually is a bigger problem at the end, in my opinion. But why are we at this point with foreign military sales or financing? Like, how did we get there that's the solution? Like, when you say the initial order was for 1,000, and there's no doubt in my mind that we were able to complete that, what has changed between then and now that puts us in a position where we have to go to other countries for production and potentially compromise national security and intellectual property, et cetera, and quite honestly, just the work to be done in America? What has changed that has put us in this position?
Absolutely, Congressman. I think the initial order for the F-16 was because it was a new platform. It was coming off the line. Right now, the F-16 is used by a lot of countries, but it's not the most premier platform in our own arsenal. And so as we've developed more platforms, we've poured more resources into developing the Joint Strike Fighter, the F-35, for instance. So I think co-production is one way to both speed up delivery for platforms.
Yeah, but hold on a second. So I get it. It's essentially what we would call, although I think it's a fantastic machine, and if I had my choice, that would be one of the things I'd choose to fly. But it's essentially a legacy aircraft from an American perspective. We should be able to turn them out like all the tooling and the die, all that stuff is done, and all the questions potentially have already been answered for years upon years. Why aren't we just cranking these things out like, an assembly line factory?
Absolutely, Congressman. I think, and I'd have to defer to defense industry on this one. I think it's simply the out-year demand signal that makes it hard for industry to allocate all the resources towards producing.
I mean, it's not a finite pie. We got, I mean, in some respects, maybe you don't have manpower or something, but that's the question. What has changed that we can't produce what we need to produce in a timely fashion? And it doesn't seem like really, I don't know if you just don't have the answer or you're guessing or whatever, and I'm not saying you should, but it doesn't seem to be that I don't hear anything that makes me think that we should be able to do this. I yield.
Thank you, Representative Perry. Representative Manning, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I want to go back to the issue of food security that we have been talking about just a little bit. Mr. Malinowski talked about the enormous benefit that some of the Gulf countries are getting in terms of banner oil profits. So, Ms. Welsh or any of the others who want to weigh on this, what is the capacity or the willingness, really, of the wealthier Gulf countries to set up and help provide financing and food to those who need it the most within the region? Ms. Welsh, do you want to comment on that?
Certainly. Thank you, Representative, for that good question. You know, I don't know specifically. I can speak to past efforts from my time at the State Department to get Gulf countries to invest in multilateral financing facilities for agricultural development, for example. Those efforts were not necessarily successful. So in my own experience, it hasn't been easy to get Gulf countries to invest in food security and agriculture for the rest of the region. I do think that that's potentially an untapped resource when it comes to the impacts on food security. Again, we're seeing high oil prices highly correlated to the price of food, which again, it's only exacerbating the problem. So I think it's a good point that you brought up.
Thank you. And what about the impact of countries' export bans on the region, such as India's recent ban on wheat? What other sources are there, potential sources, for countries that previously relied on Russian or Ukrainian imports to diversify their supply?
Thank you for that question. At present, about 20 countries are putting in place export restrictions. They're not outright bans, but restrictions on some products. India has not outright banned its exports. It is still letting some of its exports to continue to countries that it had agreements in place prior to last week. And it's also exempting humanitarian assistance from its export restrictions. Regardless, India's restrictions are coming at a very bad time, of course. Other options are production from other producing regions, from the United States, Argentina, Australia. But again, prices are global. So for all importing countries, the ultimate bill is going to be higher.
Thank you. Mr. Rumley, I want to turn to you. In your testimony, you mentioned that Russia will face difficulty maintaining its current posture in the Middle East. Which countries are poised to fill in the gap, and how can we prevent Iranian-backed forces from benefiting from this situation that Russia has gotten itself into, particularly in Syria?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think the answer was in the question. I think especially in Syria, Iran and its proxies are going to look to fill the gap there. I think we've already seen sort of initial reports suggesting as much. Hezbollah has also been active in Syria in the past. Again, I would just say I do think that while we see them repositioning, I don't think we'll see a total withdrawal unless Ukraine goes dramatically worse for Russia. In Libya, I would defer to Dr. Wary, who's there right now on that, but I would expect that there is no shortage of foreign support flooding into that conflict.
What are the options for preventing the Iranian-backed forces in Syria from increasing their bad actions?
Yes, Congresswoman. One of the issues I think that we have is that we don't have a ton of great options for it. Our force presence there is we don't have the authorities necessarily to combat the Iranian presence. I think our presence in northeast Syria and our presence at a Tanf garrison serves as a bit of a disruption to Iran's efforts to establish what we call the GLOC, the ground line of communication. But again, I'm not certain how much we'll be able to necessarily thwart them. I think our other partners in the region, most in particular Israel, are currently working on this problem set and working to roll back some of Iran's gains there. And so I think perhaps the best way to answer that is to continue to support Israel.
And what impact, if any, do you see by the recent election in Lebanon?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think what we're seeing out of Lebanon is unfortunately likely to be not what the country needs in terms of delivering proper governance. I think the election results were leaning towards the inconclusive at this point in terms of who's going to actually come out on top, and I'm most of all concerned for the future of Lebanon and its people.
Thank you. I believe my time is about to expire. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Manning. Mr. Burchett, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's always a pleasure being with you. I have several questions. I'll get right to them. Do you all think that the countries in the Middle East and North Africa regions will have some second thoughts about buying Russian-made armaments after seeing them in the field in Ukraine? Seems like they've been a little less than successful.
Yes, Congressman. I think the performance is not up to perhaps the sales pitch. But while, as I said earlier, while I do think their reputation has taken a hit, I think customers will distinguish between the way Russia has fought this conflict and the way its standalone platforms operate.
Yeah, I agree with you. In the Second World War, they had the T-34 tanks, and they took on the much stronger German Tigers and other things, and they whipped them. A German tank commander said we'd blow one up and there'd be 12 more behind them. But the interesting thing about it was that they, during the Second World War, they'd have maybe a tank crew of 4 people, I believe, and they'd have 3 different languages in there. And they had a lot of difficulties there, but apparently now they have similar languages, but they just don't have the fighting men that they did. Do you think there's any, do you think that the Russians are using Syrians to fight in the Ukraine? Has that been pretty much documented, or is that just internet rumors?
I think, as I understand it, Russia's key gap in the Ukraine right now is one of manpower, and so I would expect them to continue to call up their mercenaries around the region to support their efforts there.
So is that a maybe?
It's hard to say from an open source standpoint.
That's an honest answer. How do you think we'll be able to prevent the Chinese from filling the defense procurement space, so have it, that may be vacated by the Russians in the Middle East?
I think, yes, Congressman, I think Dr. Wary actually hit the nail on the head there when he noted that China has a lot of legacy Russian platforms and will likely be a leading candidate to transfer some of these platforms to countries that had purchased Russian arms in the past and may be seeking maintenance and sustainment for them. I think China is already active in the Middle East. It's already flooding the market with armed drones. It's already looking to market other platforms as well. It's sold air defense systems to Serbia. It's looking to advance its arms sales. And so if we aren't going to be the supplier, China's, in my view, going to step in.
Okay, what's the situation of the food in the region, the food imports due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Thank you for your question, Representative. As I noted, many countries in the Middle East and North Africa rely on imports from Russia and Ukraine. At present, I'll say that it's an open question. As I noted earlier, USDA has projected that 35% of the current wheat crop from Ukraine will not be harvested this year. So their exports are curtailed. At the same time, Russia's exports are continuing. Russia has been exempted. Russia's agricultural exports and fertilizer has been exempted from sanctions for the United States, EU, and other countries. So Russia continues to export. In fact, USDA is estimating that Russia's exports are increasing at this time. And I'm also seeing open source reporting of Russia stealing grain from Ukraine, relabeling it and exporting it at a premium to countries in the Middle East and North Africa.
Russians are going to do like Russians are going to do. They're thieves, basically. Are there any counter-ISIS operations at risk due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine? And if you could, if that's a yes, could you explain that to me?
That's a great question, Congressman. I don't.
You'll get nowhere complimenting me up here with these people. That'll just mark you down a couple notches. So it's
No,
better if you insult me like they do, like Ted does. Just kidding.
No, it's an important question. It's one my former colleagues in the Department of Defense will be looking at. I think that the biggest risk, perhaps to the de-ISIS mission or our presence in Syria is any potential one-off conflicts with or clashes with both Iranian-aligned groups, but also Russian mercenaries, like we saw in 2018 in Deir ez-Zor. Ostensibly, should Russian mercenaries be pulled back from areas of Syria, that may alleviate some of those concerns. So I am optimistic we'll be able to continue the de-ISIS mission.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back 6 seconds of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Burchin. I would, for the record, never insult you. I have just two final questions before we wrap up this, I think, really important and productive hearing. One, Dr. Nod, I just want to go back to you on this nuclear issue again. There's been some conversation here. There's been conversation generally about, a lot of conversation here about our allies in the region and their belief in America's staying power in the region. There's some suggestions that our allies are trying to manipulate us. I just ask you, since you spoke of about nuclear proliferation, from the perspective of our allies, in particular, the Emiratis who faced attacks on Dubai from Iranian-backed groups, and on the Saudis who faced attacks on their soil, and given the ongoing threats from Iran, from the IRGC, when you look at the region and you think about nuclear proliferation, it seems clear, but I want to make sure I'm not missing anything, that for those countries, the best decision is to stand with the United States against Iran's malign influence in the region and against Iran's efforts to develop nuclear weapons. And it seems also in the best interest of the United States to make clear that it is our position that that we won't tolerate Iran's malign activities and that we will never allow Iran to have nuclear weapons. Do you agree with that?
Thank you, Chairman. I absolutely agree with this assessment. I do think that there is partially a problem that the United States has at the level of perception. There is this widespread perception that the United States is not taking the missile and proxy threat by Iran seriously enough, is not doing enough, when, of course, and some other witnesses have said it, the United States is still doing a lot in the region, while certainly Russia and China will not support regional countries in withstanding the missile and proxy issue either. In fact, I would pose to you that it is to Russia's advantage if Iran in proxy and missile threats destabilize the region to a certain extent, because again, it pins down US resources that could otherwise be freed up for elsewhere. So I think that perception has to be mitigated, make clearer to partners that the United States is still very much engaged. Witness Wary noted the new naval force that has been put in place for the Red Sea. I believe the new CENTCOM chief is currently visiting the region. I think the United States could also do a little more to perhaps leverage European allies in sort of carrying the burden of responsibility for sort of mitigating the Iranian proxy and missile threat in the region. The Europeans have not been historically very involved in that effort, and Europe is the direct neighborhood of the Middle East. We Europeans are fundamentally reliant on stability in the region, so perhaps more could happen there. But yes, I fundamentally agree with your assessment that it is the best choice of regional countries to partner with the United States, perhaps also now building on operationalizing the Abraham Accords more, defense and deterrence cooperation between Gulf Arab states and Israel, where again, CENTCOM is also positioning itself in a leading role to support that process.
So I appreciate that, Dr. Nada. Mr. Rumley, then I will turn to you. The best approach, just trying to pull some of what Dr. Nada said together, is for the United States to lead the effort to stand up to Iran. That means rallying our allies, including, I think Dr. Nada is quite right, our allies in Europe. And it also means standing and working with our allies in the region. Israel, as part of CENTCOM now, means there are greater opportunities from a security standpoint to work together with Israel, our Gulf allies in the region, to confront this. But the best way to do that is for, just as America has rallied support from our allies in opposition to Russia's violation of the territorial integrity of Ukraine, we should be doing the same thing with respect to Iran, correct?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. I think there's a real desire in the Middle East right now for a type of security architecture designed to combat Iran's, or counter at least, Iran's maligned activities in the region. You'll recall the previous administration tried to sort of build the security architecture. It didn't work for a number of reasons. I think it was, a bit too ambitious at the time. It tried to cover so many different disciplines and sub-disciplines. It was also before the Abraham Accords and the normalization, but things have changed now. We have these normalization agreements. We have these peace agreements. We've moved Israel under the UCP into CENTCOM. So I think we have the window and the opportunity to start building this. And I would recommend that we start with sort of a modest approach, focus on one capability like air defense, and link our partners in the region, bring in our European partners as well, and work with our partners in the region on establishing sort of a network of air defense systems to counter Iran's activities.
Mr. Rumley, I agree with you as well. Ms. Welsh, let me just wrap up with you. Mr. Rumley talked about how things are different. I want to just finish by talking about how things were before and what we need to do to ensure that we don't go back there. High food prices were one of the driving forces behind Arab Spring, and the question is whether the food insecurity issues as wrought by the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the rising food prices that we've seen contribute to anti-government sentiment, contribute to instability, and what should we be doing to ensure that we are in the best position to prevent instability and to work to continue to address humanitarian needs and the need for greater democracy and human rights in the region.
Chairman? Okay.
I'm sorry?
Mr. Chairman, not to interrupt our witness, but I appreciate you raising the issue of the Iranian nuclear threat, and I would like to submit for the record a article that we just received. Iran is in position for a surprise nuclear breakout by Andrea Strickler of the Foundation of Defense of Democracies, and I'd like to move that this be included in the record. Thank you very much.
Without objection, Mr. Wilson, I would point out to you as a ranking member before, since you surprised us, it took a while for your image to appear, so you were literally the voice of God in this hearing room, which invites lots of thoughts on our part. But it was good to hear you, and we appreciate your submitting that for the record. Ms. Welsh.
Thank you, Chairman Deutch, for your question. Certainly, high food prices put pressure on governments. As you mentioned, during the Arab Spring, UN Food Price Index reached an all-time high, and the period of the highest prices directly coincided with protests that led to regime change in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and again, protests across Middle East and North Africa. High food prices are very rarely, if ever, the only cause of protests that lead to regime change. they do cause disruption, political and social disruption, when there are pre-existing sentiments, pre-existing displeasure with, with government or other factors. We can expect high food prices to lead to disruptions in places where there are governance challenges. What we can do to quell those impacts are, as I mentioned, all of the efforts that are under discussion in the global fora right now to reduce the price of food for food importing countries. So that's a short-term response. And in short-term responses, I would put both emergency humanitarian assistance, which it's incredibly important to continue to fund that robustly, and also financing for countries that are not the most food insecure, but still need funding to meet their food security needs, which to me is a separate bucket, and I consider that a separate response in emergency assistance. In the long term, I think it's very important to continue to invest in agriculture systems, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, where water security is a very, very big challenge, to continue to invest in agricultural production in countries that are food importing, in food producing countries, in major exporting countries around the world. We shouldn't, though, we shouldn't confuse investing in agriculture to be a short-term solution, because certainly at a time of high fertilizer prices, it might help in the long term, but certainly not in the short term.
Great. I appreciate your insight. I think it's clear from the hearing and the interest of the members, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has no doubt altered the course of world events. That's particularly true in the Middle East and North Africa. The effect as it relates to food security and military presence, the diplomatic landscape. With support from the United States and partners in the region, we will have to meet these challenges, and we have the opportunity to be a key pillar of resistance to Russian influence and aggression, both in Ukraine and around the world in the region. And I appreciate that all that our witnesses contributed to this conversation. I thank them for being here today. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for you, and we ask our witnesses to please respond to those questions in writing. I would ask my colleagues that any witness questions for the hearing record be submitted to the subcommittee clerk within 5 business days. And with that, without objection, the hearing is adjourned. Thank you very much.